Welcome to Corporate Cafecito,
a Latin and business podcast where we share insights and strategies to help entrepreneurs and professionals thrive.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Corporate Cafecito. Yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas.
Y yo soy Carlos Butler Vale.
Okay, so if you remember the pandemic, we had, what did we have? We had quiet quitting. We had quiet firing.
That's right.
There was another one.
The two ones that I really remember are quiet quitting and quiet firing.
And what do we have now?
We have quiet cutting.
What does that mean?
And the way that we would describe quiet cutting is what we would call kind of like stealthy restructures that typically either eliminate or downgrade roles, but they don't have any formal layoffs.
Yeah. So when they downgrade a role, what they do is they'll say, you know what, this was a director level, and we believe we've restructured it, so now it's a manager level.
Mm-hmm.
And you usually have the option of like staying in role or being severed.
Mm-hmm. And other ways that we've seen this potentially is when there are actual formal layoffs that are happening. Some folks are having to absorb sometimes 2 or 3 other responsibilities, and they're not necessarily getting any extra compensation, or in many cases, they're not even getting necessarily a change in title. And so, again, that is a very stealthy way to restructure an organization and not necessarily kind of meet people where they are in reality.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so we'll talk. So quiet firing was kind of similar to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quiet firing, I remember now, is quiet firing, quiet quitting, and quiet hiring.
Quiet hiring, that's right. Yes,
okay,
yes.
So quiet firing was when you just started getting excluded from projects, or not included in emails, or not part of the conversation. So they were just kind of like ignoring you until you went away.
Mm-hmm.
That was quiet firing.
Mm-hmm.
Quiet hiring was, I'm just going to give Carlos an extra project, and then I'm going to give this person an extra project. And instead of hiring for that role, I've now taken that role and dispersed it around everybody else.
Yeah.
And what was the other one?
Quiet quitting.
Quiet quitting was when you, thank you.
Yeah,
such good memory.
no, you're the one who remembered.
Quiet quitting was when you kind of just did the 9 to 5. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going in, I'm not going above and beyond. This is a job, not a career.
That's
and
right.
I'm just going to come do the basic. Like, I am going to meet expectations y nada más.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen is obviously, well, 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
The macroeconomic environment, I think right now is leading a lot of organizations. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Obviously, I don't think we're sharing any news. And it's creating a lot of uncertainty, and so organizations are having to figure out how they kind of deal with that uncertainty.
Right.
And one of the ways that they're doing this is through restructuring. And some folks got ahead of that, but one of the things that I think I'm seeing certainly as a trend is as we get closer to mid-year, we're really starting to see, what are the effects of some of these, policy shifts or changes, or maybe the lack of transparency. Folks are having to say, okay, how do we get through the next half of this year? And so that's where, quiet cutting obviously can be really prevalent. And then the other thing that we see is this is happening across all industries. It's happening across all areas. And Latino professionals tend to be often some of the folks who don't really see it coming.
Which is why you should listen to our podcast on metrics and knowing how your company makes money.
That's right.
But what I want to point out is that a lot of times this is happening because by the time we hit July, the majority, like 70 to 75% of job offers for the year have already been made. The number may even be higher.
Yeah.
So there is no more hiring from August to December. That's usually linked to companies tightening their budgets, putting hiring freezes, etc.
Yeah.
So in a way to be able to hit their metrics, the goal is we'll restructure the roles so that we can decrease payroll,
Yeah.
which is typically the biggest expense within any company.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing that we see is that over probably the last 3 to 5 years, certainly after kind of this period after COVID where there was a lot of uncertainty, some companies may have felt that they went a little bit above and beyond, particularly when it came to
Mhm.
hiring
Mhm.
or maybe even leveling. And so one of the things that they're doing is coming back and saying, we have too many directors, we have too many
Right.
VPs, we have too many managers, or whatever that might be, and that is part of
Yeah,
another
let's take it down
reason.
a notch.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then the other thing I would say is that I've seen a lot is once you get to the middle of the year, if you're not necessarily trending to be, particularly in a publicly traded company, you're not trending to hit guidance,
Mhm.
then you do everything you possibly can to make
To
sure
fix
that you
it.
look at
Right.
whatever is happening. So it wouldn't be uncommon. Typically, what you see is in budgets, you get reductions, right?
Right.
So it could be anywhere between a certain percentage of reduction. But because of a lot of the uncertainty, folks are like, well, that's not going to be enough.
Mhm.
And we also can't afford to get rid of the people that we have because we need this headcount. So how can we quietly cut and ensure that we're doing things like maybe shrinking the scope of a role or maybe reassigning projects, which we know we kind of talked about a little
Mhm.
bit, but particularly what we're seeing is title changes without the pay bump.
Yeah, so when this time of the year hits, we'll also see the T&E budgets usually go away.
Yes,
And so
yes.
you'll see that any trip needs to be approved by like a senior vice president or even by the CEO themselves. So you'll see these changes coming. And I'm telling you, because, Carlos alluded to the fact that sometimes we don't see them coming.
Yes.
These are some of your signs when there becomes a hiring freeze, when there was an open position on your team and it's gone away for some reason. And they're like, well,
Uh-huh.
just absorb the work. If your T&E is cut, if you see that
Absolutely.
there's no more like holiday parties planned, or if there was a regular lunch and learn and that's gone away,
Yeah.
when you start seeing these decreases in spend on employees or even lack of trainings, etc., that could be an indicator that your company is going through some financial
Yeah,
restructures.
absolutely. I think that's a really great point. And particularly why I think there tends to be vulnerability, specifically with the Latin community, is because oftentimes there's already a gap in sponsorship and visibility. And so when you have, say, a really important conference,
Hmm.
industry conference that you wanted to attend because you want to be a player in that space, you want your company to be a player in that space, but you don't have that level of sponsorship. I mean, I've seen it, Nayeli, in multiple organizations that I've
Yep.
been a part of. The really well connected and really well sponsored people somehow always end up figuring out a way to get the T&E to be able to do this. And in some cases, a lot of that depends on, to your point, what we talked about, which is knowing the metrics and making sure that you're talking about it. But particularly with the Latin community and that lack of sponsorship and visibility, it makes it so much easier for someone to say nope, and then basically that's it. Like it's kind of end of conversation. You don't have someone necessarily advocating on your behalf about the importance of you attending said training or whatever it might be.
Right. The other thing is, I think we're just so grateful sometimes to be employed
Yes.
that we will tolerate more.
Yes.
So, we'll be like, I'm just happy to be here. Thank you so
Mm-hmm.
much for the opportunity. Or I'm just happy to be part of the team. And instead of like advocating, we're like, oh, you're reducing the position. Okay, that's okay. I'm just still happy to be
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah,
team.
I'm happy to have a job,
Right,
or
right.
whatever that might be, or
And by
I
the
have more than
way,
I should
that
have.
may be the case. You may just be happy to have a job. And, maybe you're like, I'm going to ride this out and take it till I find another job.
Yeah,
Or, that's your decision to make. So if you do get restructured down, we're not judging you. If
no,
you're like, I'm going to stick it out till I find something else,
those are, yeah,
ultimately we have to protect our family and our family's best interest.
absolutely. But the important thing there to realize is that when those things happen, you want to make sure that you put yourself in a position where you at least
Hmm.
have the ability to make a decision,
Yeah,
right? So that you don't necessarily feel like this is always happening to you necessarily, but
right.
you can at least say to yourself whether it's, yeah, I'm going to ride this out, or you know what? the opportunity cost, which we've talked about or whatever,
Mhm.
like all of these things, the ROI that I'm putting into this, like none of it makes sense. And so therefore I've got to figure out what to do next. But getting to a place where you can actually be able to make those decisions is really, really key.
So, you talked a little bit about mentorship and sponsorship.
Yeah.
I think it's important to understand the difference of like what that mentor or sponsor's role is versus the rumor mill.
Yeah.
Because I had someone who I trusted very much, and I would always tell him like, "Oh, I feel like something's happening." And he was Latino too, and he would tell me, he's like, "Okay, for this one, you want to be on the radar. For this one, you want to be off the radar." And he would be very honest with me, and I always appreciated that.
Yeah.
And it was like, hey, sometimes we're not going to make the cut.
Yeah.
But to at least be aware versus going around and speculating like, oh, they're going to get rid of fulanita de tal, or
Yeah.
they're doing this and blah blah blah. Like, ask the questions. They may be very
Yeah.
uncomfortable, but don't feed the rumor mill. Instead, like, show that you have that executive leadership presence where you can say, I've noticed there's some conversations. I just want to address them before. I don't want to hear the news from the water cooler. I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna take that even just a step further. I think that sponsorship is really important because they can help you figure out if that's something worth pushing for or not pushing for.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've been so passionate about something and I've gone to a leader, someone who is a sponsor,
Hmm.
someone who is obviously a great mentor, and I said, I'm coming to you for guidance because I feel really passionate about this, but I also want to make sure from your perspective,
Yeah.
is this something worth pushing
Yeah.
or
Should I keep
not?
it or let it
Yeah,
go?
keep it or let it go,
Yeah.
right? I've got these 5 priorities, and I'm lucky if I can get one pushed through while we're doing all this quiet cutting. Um, is this the right one, or at least take me through? It's not necessarily a right or a wrong
Right.
thing, but it's like there's even preparation that goes into ultimately deciding when you decide that you want to push, how it is that you pursue it. And so that is, I think, really important. And unfortunately, that is part of that gap that we experience, I think, as Latins. And also just generally, I know we have a lot of Gen Z and maybe even some Gen Alpha folks that are here, whether they're Latin or not. But that is something that I'm also seeing as a trend.
Yeah.
So that's something really important to keep in mind.
I think so too. And I also think that one of the things we need to watch out for is when this happens, we tend to become gatekeepers.
Mm,
And
talk,
so that
say
means
more.
like, so as a gatekeeper, if you're working on a project, you may stop giving out information to that project. You may not want to share information because you want to protect your job. And
Yes.
that has an opposite effect.
Yeah.
Instead, what it shows is when we think of gatekeepers, we think of a person who does not trust, who is not a team player,
Yeah.
who finds their skill set so valuable they're not willing to share.
Yeah.
So gatekeeping is unfortunately sometimes a symptom of what
Yeah.
happens when we see quiet quitting
Yeah.
or quiet hiring. And so just being mindful of what not to do during these situations, and I think, Carlos, when you were talking about like checking in with someone to say like, is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? Gatekeeping is never a good idea.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say too, I think one of the things that you definitely don't want to do when you're gatekeeping, or the perception
Mhm.
that it could also provide, is that you're not working. You're not doing the work that
Right.
you should be doing, which, one of the things, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, but it's like in the absence of information coming from you, others will fill that gap.
hundred
And
percent. Right.
so it's either she's lazy, he's lazy, they're not focused, whatever it is. And it could be none of those things, but
Right.
because you've chosen to sort of,
Hoard this
hoard this
information.
information, now you're
Yeah.
giving folks, unfortunately, an opportunity to fill those gaps for you.
And then when this happens, it'll snowball into you not being invited to those meetings or not being asked about, this topic or not being included, which is going to also come to a point where they're going to be like, you know what, you're not a manager, you're more of an analyst. Let's
Yeah.
downgrade that
So
position.
actually, that's a really great segue
Mhm.
into like what are things to watch for,
Yeah.
right? I would say when you're hearing things like realignment, right sizing,
Hmm.
streamlining, I mean, those are very corporate
Yep.
terms that are typically used to or certainly what we've seen, have been used for this sort of quiet cutting.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, sometimes you do have to realign and
Right.
sometimes you do have to streamline. I mean, we're all responsible for finding efficiencies, obviously, you know, whether you're an
Hmm.
entrepreneur or you are working for somebody else. But when you hear those things, those are certainly, I would say, kind of, I wouldn't call them red flags, but I would maybe call them yellow flags,
I I'm gonna share a
as the
funny
kids say.
personal story.
Yeah.
I I remember I was at PepsiCo, and I love PepsiCo. It was like the best, some of the best years of my life. Like, I love the team I worked with. I love the work we did. And I remember one time, one of the people who I was who mentored me, he said, "You know, none of us are going to retire from here." And I remember crying. I was like, "What do you mean I love it here so much?" I did. I loved everything. I still drink Pepsi, and it's just, it was just such a big like moment of awakening. And
Yeah.
I'm like, and you know what? We restructured almost every single year,
It's a reality.
and we
Yeah.
changed, and teams evolved, and teams left, and I was just like, oh my god. And I must have been like almost 30 when I learned this lesson, and it was just so weird for me to think about like that, because in my head, like, my mom had been at her factory for 38 years. My dad also had been at his company forever. And so to think that that wasn't going to be my path was really
Because
sad.
that's what you knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it
And
is. It's a reality for
everyone
sure.
who was on that team is no longer there. We're all still in touch, which also speaks to networking.
Yeah.
But
And hopefully they're all thriving,
yeah, no,
which is
they're all doing
great.
great. But I was just like, at that moment, there was nothing I could imagine that was more sad than not
Than
working
not
there.
working. Yeah, absolutely. But again, these things happen, right?
Hmm.
Another thing to watch out for is what I call kind of the shrinking of the span of control. So that means like having fewer decision making opportunities.
Yeah.
And so we talked about, for example, when T&E decisions become now the responsibility of an SVP or even an EVP having to actually approve versus you having the ability to say, I know how to manage our budget properly, and therefore, right? So it's not, and
I wouldn't take it that personally, just because I've been in so many T&E cuts. I just think it becomes a
that's what I'm
reprioritization,
saying. No, no,
right?
no.
So
It's not
it's,
personally. It's not
yeah,
that you should take it personally, but the reality is that those the decision making starts to become more concentrated
right.
in certain
Yeah,
folks
no,
within
yeah,
the
yeah.
organization.
Hmm.
And so, now it's not that they don't trust you, it's just simply the fact that you no longer are allowed to make a decision on that
Right.
because they've decided that it's worth it to have someone at a very high level have eyes on
Right.
this,
And
right?
that's usually when you just know, like, oh, something's up with them too, right?
Yeah.
They're under scrutiny. If they're the ones that need to check the T&E, then what's that tell you about everything else?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but watch out for obviously the what I call kind of that shrinking, less and less opportunities to make some
Hmm.
of those decisions. And then, one of the things, and this one's a little uncomfortable, but if you happen to have a boss who's having more conversations that you're suddenly not a part of, particularly when it comes to that downgrading roles,
Hmm.
that's something to look out for.
Yeah.
And there could be, by the way, to be clear, there could be so many different reasons why this might happen. Again, in an environment where you don't necessarily have all of the control in the world,
Hmm.
it could be any number of things, but certainly something for you to start considering if all of a sudden you're not being necessarily invited to conversations, or maybe you're finding out about conversations after the fact, whether you're being purposely excluded or not, you're finding out that there's more that's being talked about
Right.
without you necessarily being in the room.
100%. And if you see any of these signs at your workplace, we would encourage you, like, lean on your network,
Yeah,
right? Lean on your network, because this is how jobs are found. This is how careers are created. This is how you'll be able to bounce back.
yeah,
I always think about, like, there's nothing worse than when someone needs a job and then they reach out and you haven't heard from them for like 15
yes,
years. It's like,
yeah,
no, thank you. Like, I don't even know. You don't even know that I've had two kids.
yeah.
So that's not a warm connection. That's not someone you could follow up with.
Yeah.
Um, lean on your network, engage them. Like a network is only good if it is nurtured. I can't
Yeah.
say that
Yeah.
sentence. But if you don't nurture your network will not show up for you.
Yeah, and I think just one point I want to make as we are talking about things to watch out for, it's
Hmm.
not, again, it's not to create panic in any way, shape, or form, but these are conversations sometimes that we wish that people would have had with us, and maybe it is, we're not, none of us are going to retire from here.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there could have been different ways of saying that, but just even having that dialogue, obviously created a level of awareness
Yeah, I felt
in
so
you.
grateful. I mean,
Yeah.
we are all replaceable in
Yeah.
corporate America.
Yeah. And so, having just that added expanded awareness then gives you the
Mhm.
opportunity to maybe position yourself to either say, I'm going to ride this out or I'm going to, figure something out. And that's really, I think, a big part of the focus that we've got here.
So, it's funny because when I say that, like none of us are going to retire from here, um, the hardest part of that for me to like swallow and process was understanding loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think especially when it's quiet cutting, you'd be like, "Well, I love the company. I'm here. I love my
So
team. Like, let's
I'm gonna,
yeah, let's stay."
yeah, yeah,
But it's understanding the value you bring the organization,
yeah.
right? Like, when do we stop maybe feeling with the heart and start thinking with the brain
I love
so
that.
that we can detach the loyalty? Like, what do I love about it? I love the company. I love what we believe. I love the people I work with. But then it's also about like, but I also bring value. Like
Know your worth.
I'm not
Know
here
your
because I'm a
worth.
nice
Yeah.
lady.
Know your
I am
worth.
a
Know your
nice lady,
value.
but
Absolutely.
I'm here because of what I bring, what I can do, what I've established, like my career, my experience. Like that's why I'm
I
here.
love it.
I'm
Yeah,
not here because I'm
I'm so glad
loyal.
you said that because I think that there's a balance between
Hmm.
knowing what you can. Yeah, it's like, you know what? Yes, absolutely. This company's given me so much.
Yeah,
I'm gonna just roll up my sleeves and boom. There are absolutely moments for that,
a
right?
hundred
But
percent. Yeah.
but that doesn't mean you ever lose track of your value and your worth, which is, I think, a really good segue
Hmm.
to our next portion, which is how can people respond? And we've
Yep.
talked about this before, but one of the really important things that you can do always is to take out your corporate cafecito journal and document contributions and measurable outcomes.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
whether that is for your continued engagement and loyalty at your current organization, or it ultimately ends up becoming a great resume builder,
Yep.
or for your next opportunity, you don't want to be caught unaware, because if you're like me, you're just working on so much all the time that you end up not even thinking about all of the successes.
Yep.
And maybe you remember one or two when it comes to your performance evaluations or whatever that might be, or interviewing. But don't wait, honestly. Take a moment. Maybe if it's once a month or maybe once a quarter,
Yeah.
and
Document
just document
everything that you
your
do.
successes.
Yep.
The other thing, obviously, is you have the right to ask questions,
Yes.
whether it's about your career path or the evolution of your role. So it's okay if, and by the way, I think a healthy work environment would actually welcome that.
Yeah, you should
Um,
have a psychologically safe place to ask
yes,
questions.
yes. And if you are asking questions, two things to keep in mind: your bosses don't necessarily always know. So
Mhm.
I want to say that because as
Yeah.
someone who has been a people leader, there are times where there are some decisions that you're just not aware of,
Nope.
and there are directional things that you may not be necessarily in the loop on. And that's not, oftentimes that's by design. It's not
Hmm.
as an individual, right? But your people leader should at least be able to welcome having those types of questions being asked. And if they don't have
I
the
would always
answers,
ask my boss, I
they
would be
can
like,
figure
"Do
out.
you know?" I'm like, "Or do you know, but you can't tell me, or do you not know?"
Yeah.
And
Do you know what you can tell me, or do you not know?
yeah,
I like
yeah,
that.
because and then sometimes he'd say, "I know, but I can't
I
tell
can't tell
you,"
you.
and I'm
Yeah.
like, "Okay,
Yeah.
well then you'll tell me when it's time."
Yeah.
Uh,
But I will tell you, I've never faulted an employee for coming to me and asking me questions about their career path or their role evolution. And
mhm.
I may not always have the answers. And by the way, sometimes the answer may not be a comfortable one.
Right.
Sometimes it could be, listen, this is probably where we'll be for
You
the
know, when
next
I
whatever it might be. And that's okay
so
too.
when we talk about like my role in evolution, I remember asking someone who I loved and trusted so much, who was my boss, and I said, "What's my next move here?" And he said, "You have to leave." And I was like, I was like, I don't want to leave.
And
And
did
he's
you
like,
even think that that was going to be a
no,
response?
no,
No.
but
But were you glad
how
that it,
I was like,
yeah,
how much does this person actually value me? Like, what, how kind and thoughtful that he knew there was no, like, the runway here. I was at the end of the runway. And he was like, then he's like, next you leave. I was like, I don't want to
I don't
go.
want to
But it was
go.
very, you know what? I like, that's someone who, if they ever called, I would go
Yeah,
work for them again.
I love that.
Um,
That's such a great,
yeah,
that's such a
so
great,
and sometimes, you know, having those conversations about what is my career path, they may tell you that. And
yeah.
when they tell you that, appreciate the honesty and know, like, you know, if I stayed there, would it have changed? Maybe, but probably not in the time frame I wanted.
I agree. And then this last point is goes back to we've talked about this in a few, but
Mhm.
if you haven't checked out the podcast that we did with Jaime Videri, I think about activating your network.
Oh yeah,
And
your network is
you're you
everything.
talk about this all the time, and I'm an evangelist for the networking element of it. Like if you start to see some of these, things that
Yeah,
we're talking
phone
about
a
watching
friend.
out, start phoning a friend, start maybe, and don't wait, grab a coffee, find out what's happening in their life, whatever it might be. I just reached out to someone recently. So they went through, did an acquisition,
Mhm,
and I legitimately just wanted to reach out to say, hey, congratulations.
mhm,
Like, how awesome that you're doing really well as a business owner, that you're able to now acquire not one, but two other,
mhm,
organizations. And then it turned into, hey, how's the family doing? And then it turned into, hey, how are things going?
mhm.
And now we're going to have a conversation, to talk about, what's happening in a professional way. It didn't start off that way, but
Right.
it was a great sort of segue into that. So our point is find really great opportunities, whether it's the network that you have, or if you realize you've taken an inventory and you realize that there are additional folks that you can
Right.
add to your network,
Yeah.
what are you going to do to make sure that you add them to your Rolodex?
Right. And make
Your
sure to
Rolodex.
Rolodex.
Sorry, I don't know if you guys remember
Yeah.
that. Some of you may not.
But remember, your you know, your network is only worth what you put into it. You
Yeah,
get, you know, what you put in, and if you don't put in anything, you won't have a network.
yeah.
And if you only reach out in the bad times, then you know you're not memorable.
There's a difference between knowing people and like knowing people,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
I'm sorry, it sounds so silly when I say it, but there is a big difference
There's a
between
huge
like,
difference.
and you and I have said like, oh, hey, do you know so and so? And like now I don't hesitate to say, "Oh, I've heard of them," or I may have spoken to them once. But the conversation completely changes when I'm like, "Yeah, I know that person. Did you know that they were doing X and da da da?" Like it's
Right.
there's
Like I
a
could text
very
them
big
right now and they're
difference.
gonna write back.
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
right? And so like definitely take that into consideration. So
Absolutely.
as we wrap up
Yeah.
for our final sip, what are some of the takeaways?
I would say just be aware of conversations happening. Two, take inventory of the things that are important to you, right? If it's, I don't want to look for a job between now and the end of the year and I'm going to accept this, change in role, that is 100% okay. Know that the best time to look for a job tends to be from January through, I would say, about March, April. And lean on your network. Know what you want to do. Don't reach out to people and expect them to solve it for you. Have the questions of what you need from that person specifically and what you're hoping to get out of it.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's like, hey, can I just send you to review my resume? Or sometimes it's, can you introduce me to so and
yeah,
so? Or can you leave a recommendation for me on LinkedIn,
yeah.
etc. So know what you're asking for so that when you go to that person, they know how they can help you. The worst
I
part is
agree.
like if someone comes to you and they're like, "Can you help me find a job?" And I'm like, "Well, where have you started?" And they're like, "I haven't." I'm like, "Well, what do you want to do?" "Well, I don't know. I'm good at everything." And I'm like, "Oh my god, like I can't help
Yeah.
you." So be specific. Do the homework so that
Yes.
by the time you get to your network, they're able to help because you've told them what you need from them.
I agree. I think for me, the three key things are you can still be grateful and still ask questions.
Yep.
That doesn't, it should not be seen as a sign of your loyalty or disloyalty. And if that's the case, then there's probably more questions that I would have about the culture than anything
Yeah.
else.
More concerns.
Or
Yeah.
concerns, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that a restructure doesn't necessarily mean that you're disposable, but it does mean that you obviously need a plan. And, that reminds me of, when people say, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready,
Yeah.
right? And so that I think is a really important sort of point in these
Hmm.
times is I don't believe, and not to be a Debbie Downer, that we're going to all of a sudden start to get a lot more clarity when it comes to business or geopolitical, macroeconomic things. I think there's still going to be a lot of evolution. So again, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Well, with that, we will say adios and we'll see you next time here at Corporate Cafecito.
Hasta pronto.